So my name is Joe Kurlansky. For those of you who haven't met me, I'm the president at Monarch Information Security Consulting. And this is second in our Cyber MD series featuring Mike Snyder. Today, we're going to talk about scoping, which is a very hot topic as more people have tried to deploy CMMC at an enterprise level and have discovered that is either unattainable, unworkable, or for many other reasons, just not the right way. So we've had people coming back and saying, well, how do we scope this down? How do we only get to the assets we need to? There's a few people in here from higher education. I think most of the people in here are from higher ed, where this is a very big topic. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Mike, and we'll hopefully have some time for questions at the end that we'll get to as well.
Yeah. So as Joe said, I'm Mike Snyder, which most of you probably saw me on the last session. As Joe said, we're doing scoping. I have different stuff for the education, as that is a whole different, it'll somewhat focus on how education can be broken up, but I've asked Joe to do a whole different series on that. Of course, I'm going to go over some of the program changes, stuff that is in the proposed rule. So when I talk today, some of that is going to be mixed into the session. I'm going to be talking about the acronyms. Some people are used to the old versions or what I would say is current. And then there was some stuff in the proposed rule that kind of changed the vernacular and some terms that we use and some acronyms. So as I go through and I use them, I just wanted everybody to know what they are, just in case you didn't know ahead of time. I'm going to talk about asset types and how they correlate to the scoping. I'm going to go over that really quick. And the reason, if anybody's ever seen one of my other sessions, you could talk about asset types forever and never get to scoping. So obviously, you can talk about assets when we try to go through the actual scoping process with somebody. And then we're going to talk the where to start, because I think, as Joe said, that's one of the biggest issues is where do I start? How do I know what to do? From the where to start, that's going to lead us right into how do I break up the environment, or do I keep the environment together as an enterprise, which is probably one of the hot topics right now. We're going to talk about some special situations depending. Like I said, I won't get into the special situations of specific, like an education has or a research or special DIB components, manufacturing. But some of it'll be mixed in as I'm talking. And then I'm going to talk some references and then we'll go into questions. One of the biggest changes that a lot of people ask is like, okay, what is an organization seeking assessment? I thought we were all OSCs. Aren't we yet? Still, according to the rule, I cut these right out of the rule, the proposed rule, what's going through right now. And it's whether you're looking for an assessment or you're already going through the certification process or you already have a certification, but you're an OC no matter what. If you've ever heard the big talks about going through the assessment process and whether you have a POAM, well, you can't have a POAM in the beginning due to legality. They're starting this terms of changing whether you're seeking the assessment or you're the organization doing a certification, two different things. Because level one, obviously, you're just doing an assessment. You're not really getting a certification. I am going to use this term. I used it last time and I did not bring it up. I did not, I kind of had to explain it. But one of the big probably changes over the last 2 years since 2022, when this became effective, is the unique identity ID, which comes from sam.gov. And you'll see when I get there, but it basically replaced old DUNS numbered system. You still will have both. So if you hear me say cage code, you still would have a cage code tied to your entities. Just remember, one's federal, and those cage codes are tied to DoD contracts, or DoD entities. However, it's broken up. It could be multiple ways depending on your organization. And then, of course, these references that you see on the bottom, I will, just like last time, we'll give out a reference sheet that has the actual links and additional. I put all kinds of stuff in it again. And when I'm talking, I just want everybody to know what I'm kind of talking about when I say proposed rule. It's going to be that draft rule, and that you're looking at the whole 90 series from, I think it's like 21, that we're all used to. The proposed rule. So as we go through here, I think one of the biggest parts of this is knowing where things come from and why you have to do them. Like, do I have to scope things? Yeah, you got to, but well, what does it actually detail? You can find some in the CMMC scoping guides and the assessment guide, but the rules where we want to go, because that's what's going to be tied to the contract when they drop that on. We know there's going to be these sub paragraphs underneath the 7021 and a couple other places going to be mixed in. But that DoD 2000 and 2023 OS, and then it's going to be 0063-0001. That's the one that's on the docket right now. We all had to do our public comments. That ended in March. That's the one I'm talking about. There's also the 48th CFAR, which kind of implements some other stuff, but where most of the terms and all the guides and everything else we use, they're tied to the 32. We're looking at part 170. So last time I kind of went into it about contracting, but we were focusing on other parts of the DFARS clause. We're looking at part 170 because that's our assessment requirements. It's going to list out the different. So when I talk about something and I give you a sub paragraph, that's where I'm getting it from is the 32 CFR part 170. You'll hear me say 170 B, C, and I'll go down the whole thing. As we go into these, I know most of us sitting in here, and I say most of us, I'm not really doing an assessment on my company, but if you're prepping for a company, you are most likely not looking at doing a level one self assessment. You would already have that kind of incorporated into what you are doing with your level two. If you have questions as I go through, I'm going to focus more on the level two and the incorporation of level one. But if you have questions, I broke these paragraphs out just so you can see the difference between and where they're located inside the document. I like knowing the paragraph numbers. Asset types ties to CMMC. Most of us, if you've done another framework, you've heard this before, and you're going to hear me correlating it to different asset management principles that you've heard, whether it's in 853 or you use CIS or some other framework where you have to do asset management. It's inherent. Unfortunately, this wasn't drawn out in 171. So when CMMC came around, it's kind of the same way. And then they took out a version when they took that asset management away. But we know that they're going to be tied to the 7021 clause. But you also have these asset categories, as we've seen in the level one scoping guide, which is going to fall onto the FAR with the dash 21. But when we come in here, I wanted to show everybody the difference because I think a lot of people had confusion with, I'm going to work off the old version, but just so you can see the difference between the two. Up on the screen right now, you are seeing that old asset like categorization mapping that like everybody was like, "Ooh, wow, that does nothing for me." It's just a whole bunch of pictures, and nobody's assessment scope is ever going to look that easy. But I want to bring that up so as I'm talking, you know which assets I'm talking about, and I'll kind of keep them on that same color. But on the other side, I broke out the usual table for level two, and I want to just show the quick difference between what I would call it's currently version 2.1 if you got to see the current assessment guides that went through with the proposed rule for rulemaking. But there's a tad bit of difference between the two, and there's no more of that like trying to figure out are these two in the same column or not. They actually separated the columns and the rows. They go with what asset type they are. Since a lot of people had issues with that, myself included, it's like, do I do this or do I not? You can kind of see they go into the same column. And I'll focus between the two and tell you any differences as we go. Of course, moving in, like I said, I'm going to switch back. So, one of the first things is CUI assets. You probably heard it a million times. You pray that somehow you know how to break it up, but it's the processing, storing, and transmitting of CUI. I always tell everybody start with these first. Don't be trying to like rule things out. Try to go down from the beginning to the end. Those CUI assets, from the minute a sales manager or a contracting officer, whatever you call them in your organization, but the person that gets the contract information, and then eventually, I would imagine, funnels the CUI data down to whoever's using it, from that person coming from the government or a prime contractor, from that point all the way down to the most simplest user who uses it last to make something, to do testing, to produce a report, whatever it is. And then the deliverable, the product coming back up, that same flow. How does it go? Is it going to go across email? Do we have USB drives? I know some primes like to still do Shoe Leather Express. When I see you, I'll bring a USB drive. You'll give me your files, my deliverables, and I'll give you anything that's been updated. But try to track it that way. And anybody that process stores or transmits, and I say anybody, but it could be a system, whatever it is, try to follow it through the network. Now, I know that's easier said than done because you have to know all the contracts and kind of where the data is flowing. But we talked about that last time, is starting with the contract. Find your contracts, the contracts. We're looking for this CUI. So that's kind of probably generic. Everybody's heard those terms before. I think that the key to this one and where it goes from that point is now I have a list of CUI assets, right? And I would take these, and I do this even when I'm prepping somebody or I'm going over one of these scenarios, building classes. I'm going to put them right away in my asset inventory as CUI, whether I think they are or not. And as I start working through the network and I find out, oh, yeah, that person can't because I'm looking at their security group settings, whatever folder access they're in, and they don't have access to this. They just think they're part of the project, or they think because they're on the project, they have access to CUI. So as you do it, you get to slowly start moving people into different categories. But I start with asset inventory because number one, it's required, right? For the assessment, you're going to have an asset inventory. We're going to have to break up people. Even those people that are out of scope still have to be documented. We have to have some way to keep track of if they're in our same, facility, are they in scope or are they not? And if you, my biggest concern coming from two different places, Cyber AB and the DCMA DibCAC, is assessors have a tendency to go down rabbit holes. So if they see that they might be in scope, they're going to put them in scope. So when we put them out of scope, they can look at it all day long, but they don't have, and that's why I popped up the chart. In the new chart, it tells them there's no requirements to look at it. There's no spot checking, there's no nothing. And then, of course, they're going to be in the network diagram. That's the difference here. I would not put an asset on my network diagram unless I 100% know it's already on there. You don't want to go build a giant network diagram and then come to find out, yeah, it's not really a CUI asset. Now I got to start taking things off of it. Of course, if they are down the road, you want to put them on. You also notice I'm highlighting on the other side where these actually fit in the current version 2.0. My favorite, this probably is where everybody kind of, what is a security protection asset and what is not. This is where the DoD, or I should say the DoD, but when Carnegie Mellon, John Hopkins, the DoD, and everybody sat down, this is where they slid in the one time in the whole entire scoping guide: people, technology, and facilities. Those things are part of your assessment no matter what. What they're getting at is to go through each one of those and figure out, do I have consultants that are people that are going to have cybersecurity services that are tied into my CMMC scope that need to be security protection assets? Normally, if you're trying to cut cost or you're trying to just reduce the overall burden for your team, your staff, the people actually doing the work on your network and those information systems, you're going to go to a third party provider, which inside the scoping guide into even in the rule, they are listed as external service providers, whether they're an MSSP or an MSP, they do your security, or they're just a service provider. They could be just doing your IT or whatever you deemed in the contract, but they could be involved if they're doing those security protection assets for you. Those managed service providers who do a lot of implementation, that's where, well, are they doing this or are they not? Well, they ask us to do this. If they are implementing or they are controlling, they are the administrators of that environment or a portion of that environment. They are people that are included in those security protection assets. And then, of course, the one people we probably always leave out because inherently they're going to be part of the, hopefully, part of the assessment scope is the network administrator, database administrators, people that provide enterprise level services, but all the way down to that CUI scoped environment. And when I get to the talking about the difference, we'll kind of break that up of whether they need to be in it or not. Technology, of course, you already almost went right into it, talking about SIEM or SIM. You can say it however you want, but our security event, how we're managing those incidents and everything that comes in and doing our log correlation, whatever tool is doing that. And if it is one of those third party service providers that are doing it, we want to incorporate them in as a security protection asset. It lets us know as we're going through, they could have access to CUI. Most likely they don't. And when we get to those practices, I'll talk about ways to either scope them in or scope them out by using policy language, contract language, actually going and looking what they do. VPN. So VPN services, this can come down to a lot of things. I think a lot of us are used to the old devices. So when the government puts VPN technologies, a lot of things went to cloud hosted. And there's also VPN solutions that are more of a zero trust, separating or segregating, or however you want to call it, but they are breaking up your environment by using zero trust and apps, whatever they use at the client side to whatever they're trying to get to. But keep those in mind. You're going to want to tie in any tool that has that logical separation. It's doing something that we would have normally done with our actual infrastructure. We're no longer doing that. Going into facilities, co-located data centers is one that they give you. Probably one of the, to break this down, if you, since we have education in here, if you are a university that does shared resources, so you have a data center, but there's other universities that are remoting in, or it's a facility where you share it with other universities, say to do research, projects, whatever it is, that is you are with somebody else. It's just like going to a giant data center and Joe has so many blades inside that data center, so he can store, he can run things, he can have VMs. And I am also in there, but I am from my own organization. That is the thought here. So for universities, we won't go down that rabbit hole right now, but just keep that in mind that if you are sharing, it is co-managed. And then there's other scenarios that I talked about in different seminars that we're going to have to talk about down the road when we talk just education and research. The other thing is SOCs. If you have one, remember it could be external if you're using it for your CMMC environments, or it could be internal. If you're a big organization, it's most likely you're going to have a SOC or some form of a SOC. So if you have any kind of cybersecurity analysts that perform those duties. You don't have to call them a SOC, but they're going to have to be involved to show what they do on a daily, weekly, monthly basis, yearly. And then, of course, do not forget buildings. So if I have an office building and it has the ID, so our physical protection is a physical protection asset, it's still a security asset. It may have your badging, it may have a laptop, a workstation that runs the badging system, or it logs into a cloud system, or it keeps, say, recordings of cameras that are throughout the facility. Keep those in mind because they're also security protection assets. Again, these have to be documented in your asset inventory, the SSP, and you want to be able to show them on your network diagram. And we get to the SSPs and talking about that in our next couple sessions. I'll tell you different ways you can do it because a lot of people don't like to put that on one giant network diagram and kind of, I don't want to say leak it all in an SSP, but you don't want that SSP, somebody accidentally gets it or it gets out to the public. You don't want all that information in there. Okay, so now moving on. I purposely changed the coloring on that chart to show you the difference. So our first two are no ifs, ands, or buts. They're going to be part of the CMMC assessment scope for level 2. But now we come over and we're talking about contractor risk managed assets. Probably one of the hot topics. It kind of gives us some guidance on what to do with them. If you're used to doing 853, you're used to doing risk managed anything. This actually just ties to that, and we'll see some language later. But they're part of the CMMC level 2 assessment, but we're managing them based on, our risk-based information, policies, procedures. We're actually running things through risk assessments to put them on the network. There's something, I don't want to say there's something wrong, but there could be where you have a old legacy system, something else that you need to put on the network. And now you're going to manage that with a risk assessment and your risk program to ensure that it doesn't have vulnerabilities that affect everybody else in the CUI environment. This is where we start getting into that language. If you read in there, like as an assessor, so for Joe and myself and John and everybody else that's an assessor here at Monarch, we have the ability to do spot checks and we can check for any deficiency if you don't put these on. So when they say put stuff on your asset inventory and SSP, the idea there is you give me a visual, and then if I see that you have them listed in your policies and procedures, you have a process for it and a way to document it and keep up with it, there's no reason for me to go try to identify any deficiencies in your program. That term was trying to tell you while you're doing your scoping, make sure you put them in the scope. But if you don't add this risk managed asset procedure, whatever you want to call it, to your risk program, it allows the assessor now to do these spot checks to see, well, are you really doing it or not? Is there a deficiency? Like, are you missing stuff since you don't have a process documented? And that's what they were getting at on this one. It doesn't mean every assessor is going to come around just because you have risk managed assets and we're going to start looking at everyone. That's only in the case of a deficiency. And you'll notice there is definite change in the language and the rule to hopefully solidify that so everybody understands the role of the assessor in the OSC, so there isn't an assessor trying to push too hard. Of course, again, asset inventory, SSP, network diagram, you want to be able to get these, I don't want to say 100%, you should be as close to 100% before you begin the pre-assessment with the C3PO. All right, so moving into specialized assets, this is where anybody with an industrial environment or you're making something. A lot of universities that have grants and projects and tons of stuff with the government are going to have government furnished equipment. It's where the government gives you stuff, or they will put a requirement on your contract that you need to go purchase this specific laptop, this 3D printer. Oh, but by the way, you're not going to own it at the end. It's still ours. It's ours. We purchased it and we might want it back. Doesn't mean they're going to come looking for it. Maybe 20 years from now, they'll come looking for it. But the idea is that it is their stuff. It's not like they gave you funding for IT and cybersecurity in your contract and you can implement whatever you want. These are going to be very specific requirements tied to the contract that the government owns. They're their assets. The Internet of Things, industrial Internet of Things, I'm going to show some on the network diagrams coming up. But keep in mind, if you have, and I think this is what I've seen on most assessments that people overlook, is you've heard it probably on seminars and webinars and heard people talk about IoT, is going to be thermostats. Any device that would be in that environment that has the capability to connect to the internet. And I think thermostats is probably one of the biggest ones because everybody's trying to be eco-efficient. There's lighting controllers. And one thing I normally look for if I scan a network is any ESP32 device or little board that can actually just connect to the internet itself. Somebody writes some software, puts it on there, and it's doing something else, but inherently anybody attacking the network, if that's not protected, can get right in. And that's what they're getting at with IoT. We also have it when it comes to the industrial side of the house. There's going to be some other stuff to monitor environments and mainly for productivity to make sure people are moving along or there's nothing wrong with the process or assembly line. That happens a lot. Keep that in mind as you're going through anything that would be during that process of making something from start to finish. Is there any little electronics in between that are watching what everybody does? I know when I was in the DidCAC, one of the biggest thing that was brought up is scanners. They're QR codes now, but back in the day, I say back in the day, but it was really seriously like 5, 6 years ago. They were just the regular barcode scanners, but they were connecting back to the database that had the CUI in it. And they were just scanning the parts, putting it, it would store it. So things had to be done. But keep in mind, anything that touches, and now they're all like as things go down, there's something scanning them. So it's automated. Restricted information systems. I always tell people you should know that you have restricted information systems. You're going to have some additional categorization from the government. They're going to give you specific requirements to connect. We've been dealing with it, not Monarch ourselves, but with a lot of clients is NMPI and requirements of other government programs that you may have CUI or you may have something that's in between. So it's up to that. You'll notice it with, I already gave you NMPI with the Navy and their nuclear propulsion information, but you can also see it with ITARS and some other information where it's protected above where everything else is. And those agencies will give you specific guidelines, or they will send you like an encryptor for your network to connect a computer because you're connecting back to their source to grab the data. I bring up NMPI because that's normally how it works with NMPI. That starts on class, and then you get into the classified systems. You're getting classified information to build your stuff. Test equipment, we talk about it in maintenance. We're going to talk about it in a couple other places, but test equipment is going to come across the board for people making stuff, and they have to produce test results. You have to test your whatever the government gave you for the requirement to ensure that what you're making meets their specifications. So just remember that that test equipment has to be annotated because again, it's going to be one of the CMMC requirements. And you heard me say maintenance. So when they say like, hey, they may not process CUI, but there's still a requirement in CMMC to keep up with them, right? Because they're tied to what you do. So maintenance, we have to test that equipment because we don't want people injecting stuff into our test equipment or whatever else it is, servers, the Dell technician comes, you want to make sure that the test equipment is approved. They're using what they're supposed to, provided Dell is already an authorized maintenance partner with the DoD, but still everybody coming into your organization to work on something, or even your own personnel should be tied to this one. And test equipment seems to be the loophole because we don't know everything. And it kind of falls on IT and cybersecurity or that group of people since we get the requirements for compliance pushed to us. But keep in mind, you might have to go down to whoever's building stuff or testing stuff to look for these devices. You want to have them on the asset inventory in the SSP, and then you want to have some policies, procedures around that. And I kind of gave you the one example. If I have maintenance equipment, I want to list what needs to be done with that to keep it up to date, make sure the right firmware is going into it. They're not downloading firmware or the software update from a site that's not the manufacturer's site. It's some off the wall, which I'm sure all of us have seen with manuals and everything. You can get them from just about anywhere. And of course, we want to put them on the network diagram. It's telling the assessor, but it's also telling you where they're at. I think a lot of people say it's for the assessor, even I do, but it's for the person that needs to make sure that the compliance is happening. So normally from that mid-tier management within IT and cyber, including the person responsible for maintaining the data, all the way up to your executives. There's a lot of people involved in it that have to make decisions, and they're responsible for protecting the CUI. Out of scope, I won't hash this one down. Physically or logically separated, out of scope, right? We've taken them out. They don't belong in scope. You still want to document them if they're in that same environment. So nobody ever brings them back into scope or uses like say CUI on that workstation, and they shouldn't be. And then on top of that, so that when the assessor comes in or you do your annual security assessment, you know what to look for or what you need to update. All right, where to start? So I kind of been filtering this in here and there. I broke these up. So those paragraphs, I told you I would come back to the part 170. FCI, the FCI scope, the level 1 scope is going to be in part 170B. And then for the CUI or the level 2 scope is going to be in 170C. And the reason I bring that up is because it does give you some detailed, a little bit more than what we've gotten so far. It's not everything that I think any of us would imagine we would want to know exactly what to do, but it gives a good starting point of what is expected to start putting this together. And it actually ties the assessment guides right to it. It also has follow on requirements. So look at the other paragraphs that they tied to and talking about self assessments versus your level two C3PO assessment, and then the requirements between. You'll see they have other paragraphs listed in there what you need to do, just like we're used to in the other DFARS language. On the side, I wanted to document so that people understand there is separate. So if you only see a level one requirement on a contract, it is just a level one. It is tied to that paragraph. It's not tied to the whole entire clause. Now the fun stuff. Types of assessments are assessment scopes or types of level scopes. However you heard it, I've seen different documentation change the difference between the two. One minute I'll hear that it's a level two CMMC assessment scope, and then sometimes you might hear it's just a level two scope. But either way, they can be broken down into technically by the DoD's definition, two different, which would be an enclave or an enterprise. That's how they break it up in spurs. That's how they break it up in the rule. You only ever see enclave or enterprise. Now, they just use them as examples. And then one of the links I put in our reference doc for this session was DoD, the 2023 OS 00630001. But I bring that up because in question 12, somebody asked while we were doing rulemaking the first time, the applicability of multiple CMMC levels. How do I do that? In there on page 14, when you open up that document, take a look at it because it actually breaks this down. They actually come back and they give a whole long narrative, but they give one great part of this. And is that a CMMC assessment can be restricted to a particular segment, as they referred to, or an enclave based on the assessment scope. And the OSA, the organization seeking the assessment, can define those multiple scopes or that difference in scopes. There's no like defined DoD method or way to do that. So I'm going to give some examples here to show you the difference. Granted, this is a very small network diagram. I'm sure most of you have way bigger diagrams than this, and your environment's probably a lot bigger. But as we go through, I wanted to break these up and show you the thought process as you're going through an assessment, what to think about. So let's say I want to break mine up just by a contract, right? So what you just saw pop up, most contract based are going to be tied depending on how you are. You could almost scope them down. So I'll give two different scenarios. One is say that education may have a department that does some kind of research, and you want to keep that contract with its own CMMC assessment. And the reason for that is say it's really hard to maintain them. You're a little unsure, or the requirements may change all the time. In my last one, I gave the F-35 and how many changes the F-35 contract had. It's like nonstop. So if you know where you have one where it has constant changing requirements, and I say maybe possibly, or that environment's going to change based on something you know is coming up, or it constantly happens like, oh, today we want a 3D printer. Tomorrow, oh, we want to put in, this rack of servers to do testing, and you constantly keep getting those. It's most likely going to be a lot easier just to do this portion of your network, what it touches. So if this is the contract and we're making stuff down here on our devices, right? Most of the time, our SCADA or say an IoT, some kind of sensor is going to be managing the manufacturing or building of something. You may have CNC, all kinds of different stuff has ridiculous amounts of sensors all over it now to make sure it precisely makes it. So those would have to be brought into scope. You might have obviously they're going to have a switch and some computer managing it or a database managing all of that. But from that point, if I only go to the contract scope or the enclave, I only have to worry about this switch hitting this firewall and going back out. I would assume, and granted, I broke this down as small as possible. There may be, say, a contracting officer or somebody else involved in this process. But if they were in that same scope or their system was in there, you would want to try to just push those people together and try to create your own enclave. You'd separate them. They would be the only people that are allowed, say, in that VLAN or in however you're doing your network segmentation so that nobody else can get to that project data. Now, of course, I said that knowing what was coming next, right? Let's say multiple. So I have a facility that makes parts, but we do multiple projects. I don't break up my environment. And I give this normally, it's in industrial environments, even academic, where you don't want to break up that CUI or CMMC enclave. You have created a separate network. It could be logic, it could be physical, however you did it. But the idea here is I don't want the rest of my network looked at because we don't touch anything with CUI. We don't touch anything with FCI. Everything's built onto this one side, and it's normally tied to a cage code. Now, that cage code could have multiple contracts, or you're going to have multiple cage codes. For those of you used to business structure, it would be you have multiple business units, and each business unit still has their own cage code, or they have different independent contracts tied to their own cage codes. And then you have a higher level corporate entity. I've seen different reasons and scenarios to do it. But most of the time, what it comes down to, they don't want to change the naming or the relationship with the government. So they keep that business unit's name or they keep the cage codes and all the administrative aspects of contracting and sales the same. So everybody still knows this company we acquired, they are still the same people. They still have the same cage codes, same everything else. And then sometimes they do roll them all up underneath one corporate environment. Not saying you still can't split up an enterprise enclave, but we're slowly getting there. As you can see, I call it the combination or the collection of multiple contracts where you don't have to worry about it. I would normally say that as you start getting into the enclave, into enterprise, you should be thinking about, do I do the same security controls across the board for everything we do? That's when you're looking at doing stuff by enclave, like a COI enclave, or an enterprise, because you can't really separate it, but you still do everything the same. Okay, so enterprise, right? This is everything's included. And I will give you this scenario because it's probably going to happen with a lot of people that have done compliance within their organization, but don't really do very well with data security, data labeling, or asset management. And the reason for this is you have a small IT department, or you slowly collected stuff over time. And as it happened, whoever managed it or the way it was managed, you just kept adding to it and adding to it and adding to it. And then around 2015, everybody kind of got scared because the 7012 clause came out, or you got another requirement, which they constantly keep coming. And that causes a lot of people to go, well, if I just go to GCC High, so the Microsoft government FedRAMP High cloud, I can kind of negate all this because I'm protecting no matter what users in my system from our organization, they're all protected by this Gov cloud or by my Microsoft enterprise. And it kind of stops you from trying to break up and figure out where CUI is at. You know, it's in that environment. The other reason that this is Mike, and you'll probably hear this from a lot of assessors, if I was paying for an assessment, this would be the last style I would like to do unless I was very organized. You know the exact scope, you know where the CUI is at. You're very great at data labeling. Moving on, one of the other things is external service providers, make sure you include them. They're going to have CUI assets or they're going to have security protection assets. They won't be involved in everything else you do unless they store stuff. But like I said, security protection assets, we would talk about them in certain practices. And then CUI assets, we're going to talk about it pretty much everywhere throughout all 14 domains. The special, a lot of people have asked me in the past and since the guide came out, the scoping guide, what do they mean by FCI and CUI in the same assessment scope? Isn't it already there? How would I get my CUI to those people if it's not in the same scope? Well, it's a good question, but the idea here is I do my self assessment for level one, and I'm only going to put the contracting and sales team on my corporate level network. I take them out, but if you put them into the same network, they're using the same tools, they're on the same VLANs, they're ideally part of that. And what's going to happen is they're going to smush the two together to look at the practices. Doesn't mean they're there to do your level one assessments. It means that they could possibly apply your level two security requirements, could validate your level one assessment objectives. So you're going to hear discussion going back and forth if you do have a mixed environment where CUI is stored within the same CUI, say Drive, SharePoint, whatever it is, computers are the same way. This is not my whole list. I just wanted to pop it up. The rule I put in there, documentation, direct download to the PDF. And then I also put in the level one or level two scoping guidance in case you don't know where it's at. You're just getting started. I always put it in just in case. But it is on the DoD CIO's website for CMMC. I want to bring this up because we are going to host a CMMC certified professionals class. So a CCP class, but it's a CCP plus. A lot of people have asked, yeah, it's great to spend 5 days with you, but I don't really want to become a full CCP, at least not right now. And you want to talk implementations. We've had people come to the class. So we're going to do a 2-day session, get through the actual certification portion of the class. And then the remaining 3 days during the September class, it is all going to be talking about implementation, how you do it at the OSC level. That's why we're calling it plus, because we're actually going to sit. You can ask whatever questions you want. We'll go through the practices, talk about how to implement them. and actually get a hands-on. Because in this current CCP class, like we don't go through Microsoft products. We don't go through all the other stuff because not on the test. It's not part of the exam. But we will be doing that. The links are there. It is on our training page. It's going to be all the expertise and Monarch and people that we know built into one class that you can actually talk about implementations instead of just the assessment side of the house. All right, questions.
And feel free to pipe in, you can raise a hand, you can put something in chat.
I can't believe there's
One thing,
questions on scope.
yeah, one thing I saw you doing, and I don't think we called it out, but I thought it was a great thing to highlight was as we're going through the security assets and as you're building your scope, color coding is huge. I encourage everybody, instead of just throwing little tags or labels on things, that color code different assets to different things. Makes it a lot easier on the assessor. It's very easy to look through, see what are we looking at? Why is this here? And it really ties everything, makes it very clean when you're looking at those diagrams.
Just so everybody knows, the education session we did, I did like Joe said, I went through the network diagram with everything highlighted. So I would
Louis,
agree.
go ahead.
So I went to the training. I'm interested in your
Hey.
training, obviously.
Hey, Louis.
Hi, Mike. Nice to see you guys again. I really was impressed, as you know, with your presentation at the EDUCAUSE, and I'm glad that you're doing this as a kind of follow-up. I went to your training, and I did not see the CCP Plus. I did see the CCP training. Is that the same as the CCP Plus?
But yeah, that class in September is going to be, you can sign up for just the CCP. That's our next class, but it will be the
Okay.
CCP Plus.
Okay, because that's the one I'm most interested in to bring our particular environment to have the conversations. Thank you. And thanks.
Thanks, Louis.
Go ahead, Laura.
I'm glad that you brought up the security cameras and talking about assets. I have had clients who obviously are a little bit concerned with the dual usage of their security cameras, where they may be collecting footage, let's say on the physical boundaries, looking maybe outside or at entry points. But like thinking of manufacturers, for example, that may also have cameras for safety reasons sort of pointing at what's happening around the manufacturing area. And they are very concerned if that footage is being uploaded to the cloud. Would you agree that it would be wise, given that we don't see, or I'm not aware of any FedRAMP authorized providers for that footage, that they keep it out of the cloud if it is pointing at stuff that may be CUI?
Laura, that's a good point. I've actually had this conversation with a couple DIBs that were getting new security systems. And their first question was that, is there a FedRAMP? And you are correct. It is very hard to find somebody that is FedRAMP. Normally, what I tell them is to look for a security provider that allows you to store your own footage and there is no upload to the cloud. So you want to change the direction of it and put it in your AWS, Azure. You can put it on local, wherever it is, so that is not being, you are correct. Especially if it has CUI in the camera footage, you would not want it just sitting in a cloud. I think the easiest way to say this is kind of where you were going. It's not defined 100%. It just says if it processes CUI or stores. Well, technically, it's processing CUI if it shows the whole making process, all the blueprints, the diagrams, everything is laying out on a table, and I can read it through the camera. Well, guess what? It's there. So very good point, Laura. Joe, I'm gonna have to add that to everywhere else.
Mike, I did have one other quick question that might be interesting to the group, if you're willing to comment on it. And it's because I haven't heard any great updates on it, but SPDs and SPAs, just concerns again about what we think assessors will be looking at for security protection assets and security protection data. Like you mentioned, a SOC team or vulnerability scanning tools. Have we heard anything about the FedRAMP requirements for those? Because
Sure
we're all,
have.
yes, okay.
I can add this in, Joe, as well, or if you have a copy of it. In December, the DoD CIO's office did put out FedRAMP moderate equivalent requirements. Unfortunately, I think it's a little bit better. It streamlines the process, but you're still doing the exact same thing without getting the authorization. You don't go onto the marketplace, you don't do anything, but you still have to go through the DoD CIO's office. So in the email Joe sends out after this, we can easily include that message as well to kind of tell you they're playing with it. Yeah.
Yeah,
Do you
And
think it will
those,
apply to those tools for related to SPAs and SPDs? Like I
No,
should only be.
so this is another thing. I think almost everybody's figured this out, and Joe and I probably have, and everybody here at Monarch has chats with everybody. Almost it seems like every day about this, about FedRAMP and FIPS. One of the biggest loopholes or things a lot of people don't realize is Are they a cloud service provider? Because if they're not a cloud service provider that is hosting everything, there's requirements that makes them a cloud service provider. So if I say I provide IT services and you're allowed to go in my some kind of cloud environment, right? So that's why I bring up the SOC. It technically is like if I'm hosting that whole thing for you, as long as I'm not storing your data. But what a lot of those service providers will do is they will actually store your data in an AWS Gov Cloud or a Microsoft Gov Cloud, and now they don't need to worry about the FedRAMP requirements. They need to worry about CMMC requirements to protect your data and ensure that it's actually getting there. So the transmission back and forth and to the cloud is all still encrypted. That's the first thing I would ask if I was looking for those tools is where do you actually store my data?
Understood.
Thanks, Laura. Will.
Mike, I know you said you're going to do something for education, and I warn you, this is kind of a can of worms. So I know you're probably going to be somewhat brief with this. But can you talk for a moment to the challenges of scoping in a university environment where classrooms, labs, et cetera, are shared spaces and not necessarily locked down like they would be in the corporate world?
Yeah, I've done this for EduCause and and a couple other organizations tied to our mock assessment that we did with UCSD. When it comes to those environments, that's probably where I started all this, trying to break up the scope. I think almost every DIB knows how to break them up. They do it by contracts or by programs. In your environment, you are correct. Like in a university where it is open, it's going to come down to a lot of physical and administrative controls are protecting that. When I pull out CUI, I get you can't tell the students like, hey, you can't come in here because it's CUI. But when I do pull it out, do I pull them to a different spot? What are we doing to protect the CUI in a shared resource environment? You are correct. We will do some diagrams and talk through scenarios when we do the education portion. But that's the first thing I would tell you is what can you do administratively and will it stop it? Do you feel that it's secure or is it still a risk? We do everything through a risk process. We use our risk processes to ensure that our determining factors leave no residual risk or risk that is still it's too high to actually allow it to happen in that environment. And I know that's probably you're still like, well, I still have to process this stuff with all these people in the same room. It's unfortunate. It's going to take some administrative and policies to change some of that.
So what I heard, just to follow up on that, obviously, Mike, I'm in an educational environment, is that there can be mitigating controls that further restrict the scope that you would put into place when CUI is in these common shared environments, depending on how they're structured and what evidence policies and technical controls you have in place that may meet the requirements.
Yeah, just to give a quick example, I went into one of that machine shop you hear me talking about. I've gone into a couple with the research environments. And one, I gave them the example, could you possibly change what your students do? So the first part of the day, we have students that do just regular milling, whatever they do. And then from say 1400 or 2 o'clock PM, we do CUI and the rest of those students, you're either dismissed, but you can't be in this room while we do it, or we vet all those people that are in there. And most of the time you can't vet everybody. And they were like, yeah, we could actually do that because there's other stuff they can do in a different building, or we can just let them go for the day. It's only these people that are cleared, unfortunately, but we came up with a process for them. So that's what they ended up doing was at a certain time, they kind of like shut everything down, switch over and then go, or they only, I think they ended up, I got an email maybe 6 months ago. They actually switched it. They do portion of the class where it's all open and their contracts don't have massive deadlines. So they do the other ones during specific weeks during that 6 month time period. So I was like, hey, that's even better because then you know nobody's in that and you can keep processing CUI with just those people.
So as a follow-up to that, because this conversation or this webinar is about scoping, and you had outlined the difficulty of having assessors go down rabbit holes, there must be ways to structure the presentation of this to the assessor that really compartmentalizes it, makes it clear these situations.
Yeah. So you're going to have the same computer. So in that scenario, what I'm going to look for that would stop me from going down that rabbit hole is that you have a
Yeah.
procedure in place that shows me what you do to separate. So at this point in time, I take everybody from that class. I'm technically separating, even though that's something you would do naturally, but it's documented.
Mhm.
I know exactly who can and who can't. And I have a schedule worked out. It's already done. And then one of the things I'm going to ask for is, can you show me some evidence of what you do to purge the CUI out of that environment before they come back in? What's the system that all the students go through? We make sure everything's good. And then you as normally it's going to be an instructor. They're going to go around and verify everything and do the 100%. Yep, nothing's out. We've locked everything up. It's back to where it needs to be.
So I want to make a wild assertion here, Joe or Mike. What I heard is that if CUI is in environment, then it is definitely in scope. When it's removed, then the environment itself can be handled differently. Is that correct? Meaning that, okay, thank you. That was insightful. Thank you very much.
Yes, we see a lot of environments today in the contracting world where the machine shops and these things where they will dedicate an entire area. There's green tape on the floor, or chains, or whatever it is, and they're never changing that. That's not going to work in every environment. And I think they're going to have to we're going to have to adjust in those educational sites to make accommodation for, okay, it was here and now it's gone, and this is a new day and a new class.
Okay, thank you very much. I hadn't heard it put so succinctly. That was brilliant. Thank you.
Yeah, going through the risk process, we validate the risk, and this is our outcome. And then every so many months, we're going back to check on it. Or every time we switch students, whatever that
is.
that'll help us out when we start talking just the education and research in those special environments.
Yep.
Thanks, Louis. That's a good point.
Anybody else? Every time we answer one of these questions, I feel like we've led to 5 more. There's Lori.
Sorry, I just want to take advantage. One more question if nobody else
Please.
was raising their hand before me. I've had a couple of clients in the university space that they get really nervous when they start to have to consider from leadership saying, all right, we want to include, more freedom and liberties around remote work and mobile devices. Do you have any lessons learned or just, hey, beware of or important points to make about those two areas of scope, remote workers and mobile phones?
Yeah, as Louis knows, this was a good topic at the session we did for EduCause. There's a lot we could probably tell you. Without knowing everybody's specific environment, my first thing for any mobile devices is no. Start with no, and then by exception. It's just like a rule on a firewall or anything else. I'm going to deny everything. And then by exception, I'm going to let you into the environment with this. I always ask everybody, like, why would you need a mobile device in our CUI environment to access the CUI? If there's a valid reason, okay, let's do the risk assessment and let's work through it and figure, do we need to put some other controls on it, some compensating controls to protect that device, especially with students or people, that are really, I'm not gonna lie, they're hard to control. It's like everybody that see me talk, I'm afraid of developers, anybody in those environments, because they have some knowledge and they know how to bypass a lot of stuff. And they will figure it out if you don't give them what they want. So I need a compensating control to make sure they don't do that, unfortunately. And then, so say you're going to do remote access, it's the same way. Can you do it? And is it still secure? And do they really need to do it? I know some universities or research, and I've set this up for multiple people, where the research is done by a university and a prime is actually making the product. And we have to figure out, how do we make that secure since you can't touch the workstation? You're just shipping it there to them. So I would say go through that process of, are you going to give them a laptop and you control the laptop, or are you bringing it, is it a BYOD? You're bringing it into your environment, and do you have to put some conditional access on it to ensure it coming up? And then Lewis knows I gave the other scenario is you throw the requirements back at that person. So you may have an external user or research partner, student, whatever agreement that if they're going remote, they have specific stuff they have to read, and it's a legal document they have to sign. They know they have to implement the 110 that apply to them on that side of the house. It's no longer your responsibility. Otherwise, you're not getting your conditional access. I don't like saying this, but you could force tools. If you want to come in, we're going to put some of our tools to monitor your devices since you're coming in. And it's like a 50-50. You're using a shared responsibilities matrix. We'll do some, but you have to do these other ones. Otherwise, our conditional access policy is not going to allow you in.
Thank you, Mike.
I know during our education sessions, it's going to get to that point. There's a lot of stuff that you can do. You just don't know you can do it or how to actually accomplish it.
Any other questions? All right. I guess we're going once, going twice. Thank you all for joining us, and we'll have another one of these next month. I think we're still working on a topic. We're trying to see if we can round up a special guest to join us from a very large organization about different types of tenants, we'll call them, and how we might use them. So we're hoping that works out. Otherwise, we'll be posting something soon, and hopefully we will have our Zoom link fixed by this time. So last time the Zoom link didn't go out at all. This time it went out, but it didn't have the passcode. So we're getting closer.
Joe, that was a good point. So if you have a tool, it's one of the vendors, and you're just having trouble with making the CMMC compliance work, just send us an email and I will try to link up whatever to try to get them on board, and we'll talk about how to make it CMMC compliant with them on a session. Because I think that's a lot of the issues, is trying to get them. Some of them just haven't worked with your environment, your types of people, and having an assessor, a group of assessors on with you at the same time, we can talk through it.
So if you guys have any topics you want to hear, please email me or Mike, and we'll do our best to get it on the list. Thank you all very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.